All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to the next episode of the Wealthy Ironworker podcast. And today, I want to take a deeper dive into a particular act or legislation that has made its way through the House, and is now working through the Senate. And as we'll see, I want to just kind of peel it back a little bit. Let's just unpack it. Let's look at what what it actually says. And then I want to, have a longer, in-depth conversation from a podcast perspective, kind of explaining it, if you will. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, by the way, this is unpacking. Okay, unpacking. We're going to unpack or understand the Faster Labor Contracts Act. I'll say that one more time for those of you who might have been distracted, but we're going to unpack or try to understand in a little bit better way the Faster Labor Contracts Act. Now, this came across my phone, I suppose, a week ago, maybe a little bit more than that. And when I saw it, I initially thought, well, this is very interesting. Let me take a look at this. And as I looked into it, and I think I was looking at NPR, actually. So if I can remember, what I'll do is I'll link the initial article that I happened to look at when I was kind of going and doing a little bit more exploring about this. And so what I ended up doing is I read the entire article, and then over on the website, I wrote a musing, which for those of you who don't ever go to the website, musings are just short form content, like really short form content. It's just designed to put stuff out there. It's not really designed to be super massively informative like the articles are. And I'm going to publish that probably on Monday. But I thought, well, I need to do a podcast episode. I'd like to unpack and understand what the Faster Labor Contracts Act is. And so, here we are in the podcast realm, right? So, but the Faster Labor Contracts Act is a fascinating piece of legislation to me. And here is why. If I go to Donald Norcross, we'll go to his website, all right? And I'm going to kind of give you the rundown a little bit about what he says, because this is a bipartisan piece of legislation. This isn't a piece of legislation that comes through and it's just one party pushing it because it benefits, this, particular type of constituent. This piece of legislation is bipartisan, and it's interesting that you had on the Congress side, on the House side, you had Representative Donald Norcross, who is a Democrat out of New Jersey, and Pete Stauber, who is a Republican out of Minnesota. So it's already, from that part of it. We'll get into some of the other bipartisan nature of this particular piece of legislation down the line, but this is a fascinating piece. And so I'm just going to touch on this, but what it does is it amends the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act created the National Labor Relations Board, which is supposed to oversee, the labor, if you will, the labor piece of things is the enforcement, created prevailing wage. It's obviously kind of cemented the right of people to come together and form a union. Now, what this does in particular, right? Here's a little bit of background. After workers vote, this is quote, by the way, quoted on his website. After workers vote to form a union, they don't immediately see the benefits of collective bargaining. Instead, they first need to obtain an initial agreement with management. Unfortunately, the NLRA, or National Labor Relations Act, does not impose a time limit on reaching a first contract, meaning that workers can vote to unionize only to be slow-rolled by their employer on reaching a collective bargaining agreement. For example, Starbucks workers in Buffalo, New York, first voted to unionize in December of 2021. As I'm currently reading this is June of 2026. So December 2021 to June of 2026. Pick the quote back up. Since then, more than 12,000 of Starbucks workers at over 500 stores around the country have voted to unionize. More than 3 years later, they are still waiting on their first contract. Still waiting on their first contract. Now, another piece of legislation, another a senator who is also a co-sponsor of this bill, in his kind of press release on his website, also mentioned the Staten Island Amazon warehouse and those individuals coming together, voting to form a union and to collectively bargain. And it was in 2022, I believe. And they too, up to this date, again, June of 2026, have not obtained the contract necessary to sit here and iron out what they're supposed to do, because the NLRA does not actually have a time limit. All right. The article continues. In fact, according to Bloomberg law, it takes an average of 458 days for unions and employers to agree on a first contract. This hurts workers who, despite exercising their right to bargain collectively, are prevented from doing so by employers who enjoy the benefits of the status quo. The Faster Labor Contracts Act will speed up first contracts for new unions, ensuring that when workers vote to unionize, a collective bargaining agreement follows 100%. So, and it continues, all right? So the Faster Labor Contracts Act is a bipartisan bill led by Congressman Donald Norcross, Democrat, New Jersey, and Congressman Pete Stauber, Republican, Minnesota, to speed up first contracts for new unions. This important legislation will ensure that when workers vote to form a union, employers are not allowed to drag out negotiations on a first collective bargaining agreement. The Faster Labor Contracts Act would amend Section 8D of the National Labor Relations Act to require that after workers have voted to form a union, employers must begin negotiating with the new union within 10 days. If no agreement is reached after 90 days, the dispute will be referred to mediation. If mediation fails after 30 days or additional periods agreed upon by both parties, the dispute will be referred to a binding 3-person arbitration panel to secure an initial contract. The Government Accountability Office commissioned a report on average workplace time to contract 1 year after enactment. So just kind of breaking it down and explaining a little bit about this. Currently, under federal labor law, the National Labor Relations Act, if you and your coworkers elect, you go to a vote and you exercise that right and you vote to form a union for any numerous reasons that you could possibly, anticipate. You vote to form a union, like you're exercising your right. There is no time limit. There is no time limit whatsoever that, as you can clearly see from what I just got done reading, it's almost 4.5. It's actually more than 4.5 years later. 4.5 years later, and there still is no contract. So what is taking place then is that corporations are actively exploiting the fact that the NLRA has no specific mandatory guideline for workers who have come together and a company who they are employed by to sit at a table and actively engage in good faith negotiations back and forth from a collective bargaining perspective. That's what's taking place, is that they are exploiting the fact that there is no deadline. And what takes place then is that, and this is what your anti-union lawyers and consulting agencies are very good at doing, slow the momentum is what you were effectively doing. Slow the momentum by dragging this entire thing out. I want to disincentivize people, and especially those who happen to be like the driving force, if you will, because whenever you have a group of people, everybody's going to be involved to some degree. Some are more on the forefront than others. And then what ends up taking place is that you end up getting a target on your back in some ways. And the company finds a way, because they've slow rolled this entire process. They have slow rolled everything. And those individuals who happen to be like the tip of the spear in an organizing drive, they are usually singled out one way or the other. And if you can break them, the intent is to break the momentum of said group of individuals that want to come together and collectively form a union. And that's exactly, if you're just coming to this podcast and you haven't really, listened to any of the other stuff before, I'll go ahead and tell you now, a union is nothing more than a collective group of people who come together and collectively bargain. That's what the contract is called when you're done. You have collectively come together. You have collectively bargained across the table with said employer. That's it. It's not this big nefarious thing. And even when your organizational structure has, a business manager and, you have your individuals that might, make their way up to the international level one way or the other, it's a collective group of people, and that stuff is formed democratically. It's formed democratically. So back to the Faster Labor Contracts Act. What they're intent to do is to stop companies that are exploiting things, exploiting a loophole in the NLRA. The Faster Labor Contracts Act seeks to right the wrong, if you will, that is taking place within our current labor law legislation. And what I find particularly interesting, and I'm going to go ahead and look up the other person that I saw this on. All right, so what kind of blew me away when I was actively reading this, and I'll actually, kind of take a deeper dive into the NPR article, the initial article that drew my attention to the Faster Labor Contracts Act in the first place, was the fact that number one, that it was bipartisan. But number two, it's who the people are that's bipartisan. So, for example, Josh Hawley, who is the Republican senator for Missouri, right? And on his website, because this is a little bit. I'm going to read just a little bit that he has written here. Quote: "The status quo hurts workers. Despite exercising their legal and moral right to bargain collectively, workers are often prevented from enjoying the benefits of the union they voted to form when megacorporations drag their feet, slow walk contract negotiations, and try to erode support for the union," said Senator Hawley. It's wrong. We need real labor reform that puts workers first. I'm proud to introduce bipartisan and Teamsters-endorsed legislation that does just that. Now, this is a very interesting thing because more often than not, some of these seemingly polarized issues, when you take a little bit of a deeper dive and you kind of cut through the fluff and, all the noise that people put out there, you come to find out that there actually are some people who are interested in genuine, workers' rights. And it's not necessarily this cookie cutter right down the middle. Oh, well, Democrats are for, the workers, but the Republicans aren't, or whatever. And then you have, then you see things like this, and you hear about a Faster Labor Contracts Act being sponsored by Josh Hawley or, some of the other Republicans. There was another Republican that said it was Bernie Moreno out of Ohio, who is also like a co-sponsor of this bill on the senator's side of the House. And they did this this particular like procedural thing to actually get it brought to the House floor, because you have to do that to get it past the Speaker of the House if he does not want to bring it up, which I don't think that was the case. I think they had to use a procedural thing to actually get it brought to the floor, despite the objections of people who happen to, let's say, raise the red flag, if you will, or attempting to raise some kind of a flag or issue about this legislation. as if to say, which I'll get into that NPR article, was it actually, because, they do, respectfully, they do at least cover some people's perspectives that are against this, that say, okay, well, here's what we've got going on. We want to take care of this. So, and then this next part comes from Teamsters General President Sean O'Brien. Quote, greedy corporations will stop at nothing to keep workers from getting a fair first contract. Their playbook is simple: stall, delay, and drag out negotiations to deny workers from securing the wages and conditions they deserve. Teamsters are proud to support the Faster Labor Contracts Act, real labor law reform that forces employers to bargain in good faith and holds them accountable when they don't, said Teamsters General President Sean M. O'Brien. Now, this is a very interesting thing from that. Now let's go to. I'm just blown away by this Josh Hawley thing. I have watched. There was a small bit of testimony that some back and forth testimony, and I believe it was with Amazon. Somebody that was there for Amazon, but effectively, what Amazon is kind of doing to kind of stall. This had nothing to do with the warehouse that was in Staten Island. It actually had something to do with their drivers in and of themselves, and how they're doing this thing where I'm not going to say they're misclassifying. What they're doing, it could very well be that blatantly. I haven't looked into it too much. But somebody was there having to give testimony in front of Congress, and I remember hearing Josh Hawley, Senator Josh Hawley, talk about this and say something to the effect of, what you're doing, which is like, it's not even really subbing out their drivers, but whatever it is they were doing makes it that much more difficult for their employees to form a union. And it caught my attention because, typically speaking, there's a lot of people who have it in their mind that Republicans are just anti-union all across the board, and that's it. But it's not really the case, because Josh Hawley clearly is a co-sponsor on this particular piece of legislation, as well as there are other pro-labor Republicans. They actually do exist. And then, of course, I strongly suspect that you're going to see a lot more as time progresses. When constituents are expressing significant frustration with the fact that they can't get ahead for X, Y, and Z reasons and all this kind of stuff, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The more individuals who are actively talking to their congressmen or senators, and this is a big one too, the more individuals who actively use social media to some form or fashion and begin to get the word out about how either how they feel or how things are taking place within their workplace or whatever the case may be. The more people begin to talk about problems, the more that problems begin to kind of get elevated into, let's say, the national stage. I find this interesting, and I'll be watching and probably doing a little bit more research on which particular, let's say, Republican senators or House members who are, let's say, a little gray in the worker area as far as workers' rights and that kind of thing. And this is a fascinating kind of litmus test almost to see what happens. So on to the NPR article, the article that actually got me into this particular Faster Labor Contracts Act perspective. The title of the article is House Approves Bill to Speed Up Union Contract Negotiations. It's a problem the labor movement has decried for years. After a successful union election, it takes far too long, an average of 465 days, according to Bloomberg Law, for workers and their employers to reach a first contract. In some cases, it takes even longer. Neither the Buffalo, New York Starbucks baristas who unionized in late 2021, nor the Staten Island Amazon warehouse workers who unionized in the spring of 2022 have a contract. And then by a vote of 230 to 193, the House approved a bill that would force employers to the table, allow federal mediators to get involved if a deal is not reached within 90 days, and settle the matter through arbitration if you don't get to, let's say, a resolution on your own. By the way, this thing of arbitration, it's not new. Just so we're clear, there are federal mediators that do exist. They have a job, and their job is to solve issues like this should there be a unresolved dispute coming up back and forth between contract negotiations. That this is, because the purpose of this, we don't want, from an economic perspective as a country, they don't want people, if at all possible, not to go out on strike because, you're slowing the economy down to some degree. Can we get to some kind of form of resolution? Can we have a mediator or an arbiter? And it's like, so it's not new. The only thing that's really different about this particular piece of legislation, and I'll continue on in the article in a second, is the fact that it actually imposes a specific date. It gives a timeline, if you will. It tells the workers and it tells the company, here is, like, take this seriously. Take this seriously. You don't get to spend a whole entire year, 2 years, slow walking things to not take care of the issue. And the article also concluded, it said 20 Republicans joined Democrats, and that's how you get that number 230 to 193, right? So it's an interesting thing, and we keep on down. And so here is so it's very clear that it is a bipartisan bill, and it's very clear that it has some significant support from it. But the article continues. Republicans opposed to the bill described it as government overreach, something that would be bad for employers, employees, and the economy. A discharge petition got the bill to the House floor. So this is how, I was saying this earlier in the podcast, this is how the bill actually got brought to the floor. Quote, the bill reached the House floor via a procedural tactic known as a discharge petition, the same tactic used to force a House vote on the release of the Epstein files. Democrats have increasingly turned to discharge petitions, which require a simple majority to circumvent House Speaker Mike Johnson. 7 Republicans joined Democrats in signing the discharge petition to get the Faster Labor Contracts Act to the House floor. Now, it's going to go to the Senate, and it's probably got more opposition in the Senate than it does in the House. And then if you know how a bill is created, of course, then it has to go to the president's desk. It probably has opposition there, too. Now, Congress can obviously override a veto. It's precisely what happened when the NLRA was amended, that created right-to-work states, and the president at the time vetoed what they had in mind to restrict and heavily amend the NLRA. He vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto. Now, that's a possibility, but it's not a probability as far as I can, kind of conceive. Now, so the article continues. An expedited timeline to get a contract. 4 years, Democrats have unsuccessfully pushed for far more sweeping reform for federal labor law, through a bill called the PRO Act. All right. The Faster Labor Contracts Act replicates one provision of that bill, creating an expedited timeline for what has to happen once workers vote to unionize. Within 10 days, employers must begin contract negotiations. If no agreement is reached after 90 days, either party can bring in the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, a federal agency tasked with handling labor disputes both within government and in the private sector. As I said, the federal mediators, they've been around for a long time. This is nothing new. If there is still no agreement after another 30 days, the dispute would be settled by a 3-member arbitration panel, which would take into consideration the employer's financial status, the employee's cost of living, and the wages and benefits at comparable companies, among other factors. The agreement would be binding for 2 years or until the two sides settle on something else. Opponents say it's a draconian measure. The CHRO Association, which represents chief human resource officers at 350 large corporations, called the measure draconian in a letter to Speaker Johnson. Sometimes contract negotiations do take time, as frustrating as it is, says Gregory Hoff, the association's general counsel, noting that union contracts can run hundreds of pages long and be in place for years. It's very, very important to get these things right the first time. While the CHRO Association does support some kind of reform to speed up the negotiation process, Hoff says giving the government the ability to impose a contract so soon after a union electrician is not the right solution. Now, let me take a break from reading this article right there and actually talk about this, what he just got done saying. Now, for my part, I'm a little bit skeptic on this. I don't believe the CHRO Association. I personally don't think that they mean what they say here. I don't believe that they support some kind of reform to speed up the election process, the negotiation process. Excuse me. I don't believe that. I think that's tossing out a carrot. I'm dangling that in front of you saying, while I do support some form of reform to speed this process up, what you've got put out there is not going to make it. I don't believe that. I think it's just dangling a carrot, if you will, so that I can get on to the more pressing thing that I want to talk about, which is we don't want to have these let's say rigid timelines. They could tell them that instead of 90 days, it could be 6 months, and they would still have a problem with it. And the reason that corporations would still, or associations in this matter as well, would still have a problem with it is because it imposes a timeline. When everything else, by and large, is on a timeline. You get paid on a timeline. You sign a contract to perform work, and you have to turn that work over on a timeline. So everything, for that matter, is on a timeline. You pay taxes on a timeline. So everything else that you do in business has a timeline. But the second that in a bipartisan effort to force contractors, companies, et cetera, and corporations to the table to impose a timeline for you to actively sit across the table from individuals who have come together to collectively bargain, you balk at it. Yes, they do. They're going to balk at it. I don't think that there's any kind of reform that you could put out there that speeds up the negotiation process that they would be acceptable and say, we're not going to fight this. I think that that's what it is. I think that we're just tossing a carrot out there so we can move on to the bigger thing, which is we don't want this. We think it's draconian and all this kind of stuff. That's what it is. And it's amazing to me. I shouldn't be amazing to me, but it still is, that you have a particular piece of legislation that is indeed bipartisan. And I don't mean like one person just crosses the aisle and then you can call it bipartisan. You've got at least 20 from one side that joined the other and said, this needs to go through. And then I mentioned at least 2 Republican senators that actually want to get this piece of legislation to go through on the Senate. So it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of takes place and how we kind of get it through. But I'm not optimistic about anything that the government, whatever the government, like they actively did some really, they tried to put some good legislation in a few years ago. One of them was the Department of Labor, and they were raising the salary threshold. I could do a podcast episode about this, and maybe I should, but they were doing raising the salary threshold. In other words, I think the salary threshold was like 36,000 at the time, and they raised it to 51. Meaning, if you made under 36, then you were eligible for overtime. And raising that to like 51 or something like that within like an 18-month period, because it's been abysmally low for a long time. and saying at 51,000 that if you made less than 51,000 that you were eligible for overtime. And corporations come out and they were like, no, we can't have this because it leaves us with less flexibility. What do you mean less flexibility? If you base your hours on 40 hours a week, that should be my salary. I'm working 40 hours a week. If I'm consistently working over 40 hours and I'm on salary, I am in a lot of ways, especially with that low threshold, I am being exploited. And that's what you're doing. And so you're fighting then to exploit people. And the last I checked on that particular piece of legislation, there was an injunction from some court that said, no, you can't go through with that. And also what the government attempted to do was severely restrict non-competes, meaning the initial intent for a non-compete clause was that if you were, you had, I don't forget the salary threshold, maybe it was like $150,000 a year or whatever. And this is what they were trying to do. And you were in VP status, or, like you had policy making decisions. You were high up in the company, if you will. And we're trying to get this through with a non-compete clause. You sign a non-compete because you're making policy decisions for your company, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they've become very, very prevalent in the past decade or two, I suppose, to the point that it stifles competition. That was what was said. And I think it was the FCC, which I support that one too. I supported the ban on non-competes almost for exclusively everybody. Why would I want to sign non-compete as an iron worker? You know what I mean? What do you mean I gotta move to actually work to provide for my family, and I'm not in a policy making decision at the head of a company? But that particular piece of legislation was also curtailed. Both of them, I'm pretty sure, were in the court system. Neither one of them have become, have kind of put into effect, if you will. And what it does is it demonstrates, if you have not done the research, if you don't know, then you're unaware of the power of big business and how they go in and lobby and then go to court. And they themselves, and here's the dripping irony, they themselves are members of associations, which they formed a union is what it is. It's what it is. That they have formed those, and well, I don't want you to. So it shows you the power of big business. And I'm watching this, the Faster Labor Contracts Act, and I'm really, really, I'm in favor of it, but I'm not optimistic because I know how the government is. Well, I'll just go ahead and say it. I know how they're bought and paid for in a lot of ways. And I know that there's a lot of money in corporations, and Amazon is a mega corporation, and Starbucks, and, anybody else as far as that goes. And then, of course, the National Chamber of Commerce, which has a vested interest in keeping the status quo the way it is. You're going to see a lot of big money and a lot of schmoozing up in D.C., and it's unfortunate because the everyday average individual, when they come together to collectively bargain, there is nothing under current federal labor law that says that you have to meet this contract negotiation at a certain time. Core of it all, because I've said this for so many other issues, whether it was the Teamsters and what they had going on or anybody else, at the end of it all, what it really boils down to is corporations and companies are not taking it seriously and not sitting down with those individuals who are representing others and hammering out an effective contract. They're not doing it for the most part, despite all of the interest in organizing and going in unionism, and despite all of the, let's say, all the propaganda that has been, kind of spewed out against unionism, despite all of that and all of that, you're still high interest. The representation gap is significant and real. Despite all of that, The one thing, for the most part, that a company doesn't have a specific timeline to do, which is bargain in good faith, they're resisting. They're resisting any kind of legislation that you could put out there that gives them a specific timeline that you have to achieve. That's what it is. And when you have examples like Starbucks, December of 2021, voting to be union baristas, and Amazon Staten Island warehouse in 2022, what can you say it's anything else other than slow walking and dragging your feet? And it has a exponential effect. It's also the secondary reason why they're fighting this. It has a secondary effect. If I can hold off this unionized drive from, in this case, Starbucks or Amazon, right? If I can hold this off and we can go a long period without a contract, what does that signal to anybody else, any other store or whatever, or any other location? What does that signal to them? I'll tell you what it says to them. What it says to them is, why do I vote union when nothing gets done? So the primary effect is obviously why I'm pushing this, because I don't want to take it serious and I want to stymie the union drive and union interest within the company that I happen to work for or run. But secondary, it also stifles potential others. It sends a message to them is what it does. And it says, don't bother voting union. Don't bother to vote yes to be represented, to form a union, to be represented by other individuals, because you don't get a contract. Look at this location over here. Look at this location over here. Look at that store. Look at this, look at this area over here, whatever. They don't have a contract yet. Why are you wasting your time? It's a backdoor way to effectively attempt to kill or strangle, suffocate a union drive. They have a lot at stake at keeping things the status quo. So, by way of like a recap, if you will, all right, the Faster Labor Contracts Act would amend Section 8D of the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, to require that after workers have voted to form a union, employers must begin negotiating with the new union within 10 days. If no agreement is reached after 90 days, the dispute will be referred to mediation. If mediation fails after 30 days or additional periods agreed upon by both parties, the dispute will be referred to a binding 3-person arbitration panel to secure an initial contract. The Government Accountability Office commissioned a report on average workplace time to contract 1 year after it is enacted. And the reason they had that last little bit in there is to essentially, if I had to guess, I'd say it's to demonstrate that, oh, look, when you're working up against a timeline, you put interest and effort into this to get this done. So that then they could go and say, number one, we knew this legislation was needed. We knew the timelines were needed because people aren't taking these things seriously, and that corporations are dragging their feet. Oh, by the way, here's proof. Here's our report demonstrating this particular piece of legislation that we're pushing through. And that is at the core of it all. If you don't have a contract, you have a contract for everything. You have a contract for your mortgage, your cell phone, your utilities, your car insurance. You sign so many contracts throughout your day. And yet there is no contract. For the vast majority of Americans, there is no contract that's, except for federal law. And if companies had their way, they wouldn't have that either. That clearly delineates some form of, this is what I'm expected, this is what you're expected. Hey, you can't do this, you can't do that. You're left at the mercy of at-will employment. A company can change your pay and benefits tomorrow and you don't have a contract. You don't have a contract to govern. So when you look at examples like this, you can see why a particular piece of legislation like this, the Faster Labor Contracts Act, is needed. More so. And the last thing, and I'll end this podcast episode. No army can withstand an idea whose time has come. It's an old saying. I don't know who it was first attributed to. It's probably one of those things it's too hard to discern and figure it out and trace back to its source. If you, as a corporation or as an association, the general counsel that mentioned how they were opposed to, let's say, this particular piece of legislation and the timelines imposed, but they quote unquote support some form that will allow negotiations to be sped up. If you are one of those individuals and you can see that the tide is turning, if you will, and that there is a need for something like this, then why don't you put up some form of legislation, some form of an idea to quote unquote speed up the negotiation process? They've already voted to become union, by the way. So why don't you do that? And the obvious answer for anyone that doesn't fall for the propaganda and all the noise is that it doesn't help their case at all to do so. It helps their case to keep it as ambiguous as possible to continue to slow walk things. That's really what it is. And if I don't put forth a piece of legislation, then guess what? I can continually just say what the government's doing is not going to work. What the government's going to do is draconian. What the government is thinking about doing is X, Y, and Z. It's bad, 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 bad. They won't tell you what's good because what's good for them is the current status quo. That's it. That's what it is. So thanks for listening to this podcast episode, kind of taking a deeper dive into the Faster Labor Contracts Act. And if you want to be a guest on this podcast, you can go over to the contact page, which will be in the description of today's podcast episode. You can click on that, send me an email, and then we can have a conversation about a whole litany of things. Tipping my hat just a little bit here, but this is June of 2026. June happens to be Men's Mental Health Month. And what that means then is that over on the website, I have begun what I call the mental health series, releasing articles that are robust and have a fair amount of research into them. They take a lot of time to write because I have to do a lot of research. They will also be turned into podcast episodes, various tenets of them eventually. And I am lining something up with somebody that is an iron worker who could definitely, his story and, because the trades, there's a lot of substance abuse that goes on in the trades, and there's a lot of recovery that can go on. And sometimes just hearing one person recover is helpful, and it might help you do the same. All right. So thanks for listening. And as always, stay safe out there.